On the morning of February 8, 1945, at 0600 hours, Sergeant Joe Mason crouched behind the steel hull of his M16 half-track in the thick jungle of Luzon, watching Japanese soldiers run across a muddy open space 400 yards away through smoke from artillery fire. At 24 years old, he was a Marine squad leader with 0 confirmed kills, using the Quad 50 mount facing an enemy that had made 17 banzai attacks against the 2nd Battalion in just the last 48 hours. His commanding officer had told him the M16 was made for shooting down airplanes, and the other Marines joked that using anti-aircraft guns on soldiers was like trying to kill flies with a big hammer. When Mason first saw the M16 back at Camp Pendleton in California with its 4 50 caliber machine guns on a powered turret, the armorer even asked if it was for planes or tanks. Mason told him it was for whatever the bosses said, but no one had shown how to use 1,800 rounds per minute against charging soldiers. The vehicle weighed 16 tons, with each of the 4 M2 Browning machine guns able to fire 2,400 rounds per minute, compared to a regular bar, 350 rounds per minute, with no turret. His mount had 4 barrels with overlapping shooting areas. The bar had 1 barrel with short range. Captain Morris told him to save ammo for enemy airplanes, but Mason loaded armor-piercing fire rounds anyway. By then, the 5th Marine Regiment had been fighting on Luzon since January 9th, moving inland from Lingayen Gulf, but having trouble against Japanese dug-in positions in the mountains. The land was harsh, with thick jungle cover, steep hills, and cave systems that had been reinforced for months. Japanese soldiers attacked together every night, coming from hidden bunkers and charging with bayonets while yelling battle cries that bounced through the trees. On February 5th, a banzai charge broke Fox Company's perimeter. On the 6th, another got through Easy Company's lines. On the 7th, 3 more attacks killed 14 Marines, including 2 machine gunners shot at very close range. That night, the battalion leader called Mason. The Japanese were killing his men faster than malaria, and he needed something that could stop a human wave attack. He asked if the anti-aircraft gun could actually hit anything on the ground. Mason explained the details. Each 50 caliber bullet went at 2,800 feet per second, with a hitting power of 13,000 foot-pounds, able to go through armor at 1,500 yards, and made to destroy airplane engines. The commander told him he had until dawn to find out what it could do to soldiers running at them. The early darkness of February 9th hung over the Luzon mountains like a black blanket, broken only by faraway booms of artillery and the metal clanking of tracked vehicles moving through jungle mud. Sergeant Joe Mason pressed his back against the cold steel of the M16 half-track, feeling the vibration of its running engine in his spine as he watched the tree line 300 yards ahead. The Quad 50 mount towered above him like a giant metal spider, its 4 barrels aimed into the dark where Japanese soldiers had been checking their perimeter since midnight. Mason had been awake for 36 hours straight, his hands shaking not from fear, but from being tired and from the heavy responsibility his commander had given him. The M16 had arrived at their forward spot 12 hours ago, carried by a Red Ball Express convoy that had fought through 2 ambushes to reach the 2nd Battalion. Mason's crew had spent the evening learning the weapon from a Navy gunner's mate who said he had never fired it at soldiers on the ground. The manual explained how to shoot at airplanes flying 5,000 to 20,000 feet, with charts to calculate aiming and burst patterns for bombers flying straight. Nothing said what to do when you aimed 4 50 caliber machine guns at soldiers running across open land. Corporal Frank Thomas crouched by the turret controls, his fingers moving over switches and dials as he ran the firing steps for the 10th time that night. Each of the 4 M2 Browning guns had a belt of 160 rounds, feeding from ammo boxes that could be reloaded in under 30 seconds by trained hands. The gunner seat was soft and could move around, made for long flights where comfort was more important than safety. On the ground in jungle that could hide snipers at 50 yards, the open turret felt exposed and dangerous. Thomas had wrapped extra ammo belts around the guns and stacked sandbags along the half-track, making an anti-aircraft gun look like a small fortress. At 0545, the Japanese artillery started its bombing. Mason counted the shells by their whistle and crash, 6 75mm rounds, probably from a Type 94 mountain gun somewhere up in the ridges. The shells exploded in the trees behind them, sending pieces of wood and metal off the half-track and filling the air with smoke and gunpowder smell. Japanese rules set to fire fast and hard for a short time, then attack with soldiers, so defenders could not shoot well while attackers ran across open land. The first Japanese soldiers appeared at the edge of the open space at 0552, moving in a line that stretched 200 yards along the jungle edge. Mason counted at least 40 men, maybe more, hidden in the plants, armed with Arisaka rifles and light machine guns. Their clothes were torn and covered in mud, showing that they'd spent weeks living in caves and fighting a losing battle against stronger American firepower. These were not the fresh troops who had defended Luzon's beaches in January, but experienced soldiers who had survived 2 months of constant fighting and knew exactly what to expect. Lieutenant Haruto Yamamoto led the attack from the middle of the line, his sword held high as he shouted orders in Japanese. His men yelled the traditional battle cry that had scared Allied soldiers across the Pacific, a sound full of both anger and desperation. They moved at a steady trot, not the wild run of a banzai charge, but the careful march of soldiers who understood the land and timing. Their goal was clearly the American machine gun positions that had killed their night patrols and moved like men who had broken Marine lines before. Mason's radio crackled with reports from observation posts in the jungle. Charlie 6, this is Lima 1. Count 40 enemy soldiers coming from the north. They are spaced about 10 yards apart. Wait, I see more in the trees. Make that 60 enemy, maybe more. The radio went to static as Japanese mortar shells fell on forward positions, cutting telephone lines and forcing spotters to hide. Thomas turned the turret to face the advancing Japanese, the electric motors whining as 4 heavy machine guns swung to aim. The M16's fire system had been made for airplanes moving in straight patterns at known heights, but soldiers walking across uneven ground were a challenge the engineers had not planned. The guns were calibrated for targets moving hundreds of miles per hour, not slow soldiers stepping through jungle debris. The Japanese reached halfway across the clearing when Mason said to fire. Thomas pressed both trigger buttons at once, sending 2 streams of 50 caliber bullets at the enemy at a total of 4,800 rounds per minute. The sound was like nothing Mason had heard in 2 years of fighting, not the sharp crack of rifles or the steady chatter of normal machine guns, but a nonstop roar that seemed to tear the air. Flashes of fire lit the clearing like strobe lights, casting moving shadows in the trees and filling the night with the sharp smell of burning powder. The effect on the Japanese was instant. Word of the Quad 50's terrible power spread through both armies before dawn, carried by survivors who would never run across open ground with the same courage again. The news of the massacre spread through Japanese lines fast, carried by a few survivors who crawled back through the jungle, telling stories that their officers first thought were just fear. Sergeant Major Akira Suzuki got the first report at 0730 from a private whose left arm hung useless, shredded by 50 caliber pieces. The man rambled about American guns that fired like thunder and turned soldiers into mist, his eyes full of fear Suzuki had never seen in 20 years of service. By noon, similar stories came from observation posts in the mountains, all talking about the same deadly weapon that could wipe out squads in seconds. The meaning for tactics became clear in the afternoon briefing at regimental headquarters, held in a cave dug from solid rock and reinforced with wood taken from abandoned Filipino villages. Colonel Tishi Yamada studied intelligence that showed American firepower unlike anything in past Pacific battles. His staff officers, veterans of Guadalcanal and Saipan, struggled to understand a weapon that could shoot like a whole company from one vehicle.
The Americans had always had better artillery and air support, but this was something different. Portable destruction that could be placed wherever the enemy moved. Japanese tactics had grown over 3 years of island fighting, using land and surprise attacks to beat American firepower. Their defenses were built to force enemy troops into kill zones, where hidden fire could cause many losses before they moved back to secondary positions. The system had worked against normal weapons, forcing American forces to pay heavily for every yard of land. But the Quad 50 changed every rule that shaped their strategy. Suzuki gathered his platoon leaders at 1700 hours to plan new defenses, meeting in a bunker that took 3 weeks to build, using hand tools and explosives taken from unexploded American bombs. The men with him were the best of Japanese infantry, survivors of battles from Manchuria to the Philippines, soldiers who had adapted to every weapon the Allies used against them. Their faces showed the stress of nonstop fighting, but also the hard determination that made them dangerous opponents in the Pacific War. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka, leading 2nd Platoon, had watched the morning fight from an observation post 500 yards from the killing ground. His report was clear and careful, spoken in the flat voice of a trained soldier, describing real battlefield facts. The American weapon looked like a changed half-track, with 4 heavy machine guns in a powered turret able to fire longer than anything in the Japanese arsenal. Its deadly range was at least 600 yards, maybe more, and it could turn fast enough to hit many targets at once across a wide area. The mental shock was just as strong. Tanaka's men had fought flamethrowers and napalm weapons that burned slowly and painfully, but the Quad 50 gave death so fast and complete that soldiers simply vanished. Japanese infantry tactics depended on soldiers willing to die for the emperor, but bravery meant nothing when full squads could be wiped out before reaching the enemy. The weapon attacked the heart of Bushido by making personal courage useless against huge mechanical power. Reports showed the Americans had at least 3 of these weapons in the 2nd Battalion's area, with more arriving as supply convoys pushed forward. Japanese scouts had seen M16 half-tracks moving along jungle trails once thought impossible for vehicles, showing American engineers were quickly improving roads to support heavy weapons. The supply needs were enormous. Each Quad 50 needed thousands of 50 caliber rounds, tons of fuel, and special work by trained technicians. Suzuki's new plans showed the desperate creativity of late-war Japanese tactics. Straight attacks were certain death, but sneaking tactics might work if done at night or in bad weather. Small teams with magnetic mines and satchel charges might slip into American lines and destroy the weapons before they fired, though these missions would basically be suicide with almost no chance of success. The evening patrol came back with photos taken through captured American binoculars, showing M16 positions quickly protected with sandbags and camouflage nets. The vehicles were guarded by infantry squads with automatic weapons and set up to give overlapping fire that made getting close very hard. American engineers had cleared plants for hundreds of yards in all directions, removing any cover that sneaks might use at night. Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, the regimental intelligence officer, gave a report that confirmed their worst fears about American tactics. Radio messages suggested Marine leaders were quickly putting Quad 50 weapons into normal infantry operations, using them as mobile firing bases that could move fast to respond to Japanese defenses. The Americans were learning to use these weapons with artillery and airstrikes, making layers of defense that could destroy attackers at different ranges at the same time. Captured papers included technical details showing the full danger. Each M2 Browning gun fired bullets weighing 750 grains at speeds over 2,800 feet per second, with enough power to go through light armor at long distances. The guns used disintegrating link belts, letting them fire non-stop without long reloads that Japanese machine guns needed, removing the small chances infantry had to attack. During this time, Japanese soldier morale dropped as news of the Quad 50's power spread through their lines. Veterans who survived Guadalcanal and Bougainville spoke quietly about weapons that made resistance pointless, while new soldiers asked about surrender, which was unthinkable weeks before. Officers had trouble keeping order as desertions rose and sick reports grew, clear signs that their force was starting to fall apart under mental pressure stronger than in past battles. The last radio report of the day came from a post on a ridge above the main American supply route, reporting another convoy carrying more M16 half-tracks toward front lines. The observer counted at least 6 vehicles, showing the Americans were gathering Quad 50 weapons for a big attack that would make Japanese defenses impossible. Suzuki heard the report and started planning withdrawals to save what was left of his troops, knowing normal fighting was hopeless against weapons that turned war into mechanical killing. The nightmare started on February 11th, spreading through Japanese positions like a sickness that no doctor could treat. Private Ichiro Watanabe woke screaming at 0200 hours, his cries echoing through the cave system until Sergeant Major Suzuki stopped him with a hit to the head. The young soldier had not even seen the Quad 50 massacre, but stories from survivors filled his dreams with visions of friends dissolving in sprays of blood and bone pieces. Similar things happened all night as tired men jerked awake from sleep that gave no escape from the mechanical thunder that haunted them while awake. The fear spread beyond individual nightmares and affected the whole unit, making soldiers break rules and lose discipline. Many abandoned their posts rather than risk being hit by weapons that killed without warning, while patrol leaders lied in reports rather than go to places where American half-tracks might be. The usual Japanese acceptance of death in battle depended on the chance for honorable sacrifice, but the Quad 50 only gave meaningless destruction that served no plan and honored no tradition. Lieutenant Haruto Yamamoto's younger brother, Second Lieutenant Taro Yamamoto, arrived at regimental headquarters on February 12th, carrying orders from division headquarters and a personal letter from their father in Kyoto. The letter, written before news of Haruto's death had reached Japan, talked about family honor and the sacred duty to fight American invasion no matter the cost. Taro read the letter aloud to officers who had seen the terrible power of weapons that made such sacrifices pointless, creating a mental shock that broke traditional military values more than any enemy propaganda. The sound of the Quad 50 became a trigger that caused panic. Soldiers who heard the roar of 4 machine guns froze in terror or ran from their positions, leaving weapons and gear in their desperate attempt to escape destruction they knew was coming. Officers trying to keep order faced men whose nerves had been rewired by power that was beyond human ability to resist or understand. Radio intercepts showed how much fear had spread through Japanese communications. Operators used coded words to avoid talking directly about the American weapons, calling them thunder gods or iron demons in messages that became more confused as stress grew. Messages that should have given tactical information instead warned about supernatural forces that no army could fight, showing the collapse of rational thinking against technology that seemed almost magical in its deadly efficiency. The Americans, listening to these radios through captured equipment and prisoner questioning, began to see the psychological weapon they had accidentally created. Captain James Morris, leading the Marine Company with 3 M16 half-tracks, got intelligence briefings showing Japanese morale breaking like never before in Pacific fighting. Enemy soldiers were giving up instead of facing the Quad 50 weapons, leaving defensive positions that had taken weeks to build and strengthen. Corporal James Harris, listening to Japanese radio from the battalion command post, recorded talks that showed how weak the enemy's minds had become. Officers talked openly about retreat options that went against orders to hold at any cost, while regular soldiers talked about surrender, breaking rules that said death was better than dishonor. The intercepted messages showed an army losing its core strength as old values crumbled under new technology. The first organized Japanese surrender happened on February 14th, when a whole platoon came to Marine lines with a white flag made from a torn undershirt. The 37 soldiers who came out of a cave had survived 72 hours of indirect fire from Quad 50 weapons placed almost a mile away. Their positions were destroyed by armor-piercing bullets that went through rock and wood equally. The platoon leader, a veteran sergeant with ribbons from China and the Dutch East Indies, said through an interpreter that fighting was now suicide, with no military purpose. Similar surrenders happened more in the following week as news of survivors spread through Japanese lines, even though officers tried to hide it. Small groups started coming to Marine posts with makeshift white flags, leaving their weapons behind and wearing uniforms of units that had fought fiercely before. Intelligence officers asking questions found that these men had not been beaten in normal fighting, but had been broken by weapons that challenged their ideas of war. The Quad 50 had gone beyond anti-aircraft use into psychological warfare in ways its makers never planned. Marine crews said Japanese positions were often left before the guns fired, with soldiers running at the
first sound of tracked vehicles in the jungle. The fear alone made defensive positions useless. Sergeant Major Suzuki called his remaining officers for what he knew would be their last tactical meeting in a bunker shaking from distant artillery. The men with him were pieces of units destroyed not by fighting, but by the mental pressure of facing weapons that made old military values useless. Their uniforms were torn, dirty, and their eyes empty with tiredness and something deeper, like the shell shock he had seen in captured American soldiers. The choice to withdraw did not come from higher command, but from the shared understanding that keeping on fighting had no military point and would only destroy soldiers whose sacrifice could not achieve any goal. Suzuki wrote the withdrawal order using military words to make it seem like a tactical move, though everyone knew they were leaving positions they had been told to hold to the death rather than face weapons that killed without honor or purpose. The retreat started that night under darkness that gave some mental comfort even though Americans had night fighting skills that made hiding mostly useless. Soldiers moved in small groups along jungle paths built over weeks, carrying only personal guns and leaving heavy gear that was useless against enemies who fought with mechanical accuracy, not human bravery. The retreat marked the real end of organized Japanese resistance in this area, done not by normal military defeat, but by breaking the morale that had kept them going for 3 years against superior American power. The cave complex on Hill 212 was the last organized Japanese defense in the 2nd Battalion area, a maze-like fortress carved from volcanic rock and reinforced with steel beams from destroyed bridges. Intelligence said 300 enemy soldiers were inside, led by Colonel Yamada, and supplied through underground tunnels that connected to artillery behind the slope. The natural rocks protected them from normal weapons and offered many firing spots to cover approaches with overlapping fire from hidden machine gun nests. Captain Morris got the attack order at 0500 hours on February 18th, with detailed photos showing the tough challenge his Marines would face. The cave entrances were halfway up a steep hill, with fallen logs and volcanic rocks making natural obstacles that would force any attack into kill zones. Japanese engineers had spent weeks improving defenses with barbed wire, mines, and camouflaged positions that could hold riflemen with telescopic-sighted Arisaka rifles able to shoot accurately over 600 yards. The first bombardment started at 0630 with 105mm howitzer shells for 20 minutes, causing little effect against solid rock. Observers reported secondary explosions from ammo storage, but main defenses stayed ready. Smoke shells in the final barrage covered advancing infantry and marked the start of the attack phase that would test the Quad 50 weapons against prepared defenses for the first time. Sergeant Mason's M16 moved up the hill with 2 other half-tracks, their tracks grinding on loose rocks as they climbed to positions that could shoot directly into the cave entrances. The vehicles moved single file along a trail that engineers had blasted from the hillside, making a path barely wide enough for tracked vehicles and giving no room to maneuver if the front ran into obstacles or enemy fire. Japanese mortar rounds started falling around the half-tracks at 0715, their explosions sending rocks bouncing off armor without hurting the heavily protected vehicles. Corporal Thomas turned his turret toward the largest cave entrance, a hole about 12 feet wide and 8 feet high that photos had shown as the main access to the underground complex. The Quad 50 guns were loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds and normal bullets, making a mix meant to punch through rock and start fires inside the tunnels where Japanese soldiers hid. The technical problem was keeping accuracy while shooting upward at targets partly hidden by rocks that could make bullets bounce in unexpected ways. The first burst of Quad 50 fire hit the cave at 0722, sending 4 streams of 50 caliber rounds into the opening at a rate of almost 5,000 rounds per minute.
The armor-piercing rounds cut through rock barriers made to stop bullets and artillery, while incendiary parts set off ammo and gear inside the tunnels. Secondary explosions showed that the fire reached Japanese supply areas, starting fires that used up oxygen and made poisonous gases inside the cave. Japanese soldiers trying to shoot back from hidden spots faced weapons that could hit whole sections of the line at once. The Quad 50's overlapping fire meant any position that shot became the target of devastating return fire that could destroy it in seconds. Japanese defensive tactics depended on careful fire from multiple spots, but the American guns made this impossible by destroying any position that revealed itself with muzzle flash or movement. Colonel Yamada's command bunker deep in the caves and connected to forward positions became a trap as smoke and toxic gas from burning equipment filled the tunnels, making it hard to breathe and see. Radio contact with forward troops failed as antennas were destroyed and telephone lines were cut by rounds that pierced deep into rock. The mental effect on Japanese soldiers trapped inside the burning caves was worse than anything they had faced before. Men who survived artillery and flamethrowers now faced weapons that seemed to be able to reach them no matter how solid the rock barriers were. The non-stop roar of Quad 50 fire made sounds inside the tunnels so loud that it hurt hearing and made defenders dizzy who could not tell where bullets were coming from. Second Lieutenant Taro Yamamoto led a desperate counterattack at 0845, coming out of a hidden tunnel with 30 soldiers carrying rifles, light machine guns, and magnetic anti-tank mines that could damage the M16 half-tracks if placed close. The attack surprised everyone and got within 50 yards of Mason's position before Marine infantry protecting the Quad 50 guns saw them. The firefight lasted less than 3 minutes and ended with all the Japanese soldiers destroyed, including Yamamoto, who died trying to put a mine on the M16's track. The clearing of the cave complex went on for 2 hours, with Marine crews targeting every opening that could hide a fighter. Armor-piercing bullets went deep into tunnels, while incendiary parts started fires that burned equipment and forced Japanese soldiers toward exits covered by American guns. The Quad 50 fire was so strong that rock walls broke from repeated hits, making landslides that closed some tunnels and exposed others to direct fire. At 10:30, a white flag showed at the main cave entrance, followed by Colonel Yamada leading 43 surviving soldiers. His uniform was torn and black from smoke, his face empty from seeing defensive tactics that had worked for the Imperial Army fail. His surrender followed military rules, but everyone knew the Quad 50 guns won through technology, not old military skill. The fight at Hill 212 showed how totally the Quad 50 could dominate even the strongest defenses when supported by regular infantry and artillery. Japanese resistance in the area collapsed within hours as news of the fortress falling spread through remaining units, many of which started to retreat without fighting more against weapons that could destroy any position no matter the protection. The silence over the Luzon mountains after February 20th was deeper than any ceasefire could make, broken only by far-off sounds of American supply convoys carrying ammo and gear that would no longer be needed for battle. Sergeant Joe Mason sat on his M16 half-track cleaning 50 caliber machine gun barrels that had fired over 30,000 rounds in 12 days of non-stop fighting, each barrel worn smooth from bullets that changed war in ways no military expert expected. The Quad 50 guns finished missions that would have taken normal forces weeks, turning what should have been a long siege into a retreat that spread Japanese defenders over hundreds of square miles of jungle. The mental effects were harder than the battle itself. Corporal Frank Thomas developed a shake in his right hand, making fine movements hard, a physical sign of stress that doctors said came from long exposure to the powerful, heavy gunfire. His medical records later showed hearing loss from the loud noise, but the mental part could not be diagnosed or treated. The same problems showed up in other Marine units using Quad 50 guns, showing that the weapon's power cost their crews more than seen during the fight. Intelligence officers studying the battle found Japanese resistance collapsed far beyond the 2nd Battalion area, with units leaving positions they held for months rather than face weapons that could destroy any defense. Radio intercepts showed Japanese commanders talking about retreat routes, avoiding places with American half-tracks, showing the Quad 50 had changed enemy tactics across the Luzon campaign. Captured Japanese soldiers explained how their army had been mentally defeated by weapons that broke their basic ideas of war and honor. Colonel Yamada, interviewed 3 days after surrender, said his troops lost faith in resisting American technology with old military skill. His officers said soldiers who fought well in China and the Pacific became useless against weapons that seemed to break the rules between courage and survival. American observers studying Quad 50 tactics started making new plans using lessons from Luzon. The guns could get fire control better than any existing weapon, but needed a lot of ammo and could work in only certain terrain and situations. Reports said each M16 used so much ammo that special supply efforts were needed, and repairs needed skilled technicians. The bigger strategy became clear as intelligence from other Pacific areas showed the same mental effect.
Wherever Quad 50 guns were used, enemy commanders changed their tactics to avoid fighting heavy American weapons, choosing to retreat instead of holding positions once thought safe. This showed the weapons were achieving strategic goals beyond just winning the battlefield. Corporal James Harris wrote reports about how American tactics changed that would guide heavy weapons use for decades after the war. Marine units with Quad 50 guns made new plans to use these weapons with regular infantry and artillery to get the most psychological effect while keeping supply problems low. The guns changed from anti-aircraft tools into psychological weapons that won battles by breaking enemy morale instead of traditional military goals. Medical staff treating Japanese prisoners saw trauma different from normal wounds, showing that being under Quad 50 fire caused mental damage that lasted long after physical injuries healed. Military psychiatrists saw symptoms like shell shock, but with signs that the experiences were too much for humans to handle. These reports helped early understanding of what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Even though the effects of extreme gunfire were not fully known, Mason's crew got awards for their tactical success while avoiding mentioning the psychological effects. Official reports talked about destroying enemy positions and capturing objectives, but did not mention the fear that had broken Japanese morale. This reflected military discomfort with weapons that won battles in ways that went against old ideas of honorable war. The final Japanese surrender in the area happened on February 28th, when Sergeant Major Suzuki came to Marine lines leading the last 87 soldiers of his command. These men had survived 2 weeks of mental pressure stronger than months of regular fighting. Suzuki's statement, translated by intelligence officers and kept in military records, said his troops lost the will to fight against weapons that made personal courage useless and made training meaningless. Post-war studies showed Quad 50 guns caused record casualty ratios in the Pacific, killing over 1,500 Japanese soldiers while the Americans lost fewer than 30 men. A fight that showed how much stronger weapons were that could fire a lot of bullets precisely, faster than humans could react or avoid. These numbers shaped post-war military planning and led to new rules that focused on having better technology instead of old infantry tactics. The lessons from Luzon went beyond the battlefield to basic ideas about war and how technology affects military success. Weapons made for special jobs became tools of mental control that won battles by breaking enemy morale instead of normal fighting. The experience showed that future wars would be decided by technology instead of old military skills. A prediction that turned out true in later years as war changed to machines and impersonal ways of using huge force that made human bravery and determination not matter in deciding who won fights.